The knife is the Resident Evil 4 Remake's greatest asset. What started out as a simple question of how is the Krauser fight gonna work if there's no more QTEs, blossomed into an entire system so well integrated into the original game's template, you have to wonder how it was never there in the first place. It retains all its uses from the original, but adds a parry, stealth kill, and grab escape, which all decrease its durability in differing amounts. This extreme versatility is balanced out by the constant need to repair it, which complicates the pre-existing shop and upgrade systems wonderfully. Do I spend this money on a temporary fix for the knife, or invest in something more permanent? This is a great question that the original wasn't really capable of asking, not to mention that the quick timing on parries adds an instinctual element to resource management. While earlier games in the series let you think through the ramifications of your choices, here you're only given a handful of frames to decide if parrying an attack is worth it or not. A similarly welcome addition is a crafting system which injects a little bit more decision-making into the previously RNG-determined ammunition drops. It feeds back cleverly into the knife system as well, since the disposable knives you find lying around can be used to craft ammo for the new bolt thrower weapon. This takes the place of the mine thrower from the original, which I think was a smart call. It's a more versatile weapon, allowing you to fire either regular bolts, which can be retrieved after an enemy is downed, or explosive ones, which can end fights before they even begin if you're careful about where you place them. While not quite on the same level as the Looney Tunes shenanigans you could conjure in Shinji Mikami's follow-up to RE4, The Evil Within, the revamped combat in this remake does enough to channel that game's scrappy spirit, while further highlighting what made the original game so special. As much as I enjoy these changes, none of them were strictly necessary per se. The miracle of Resident Evil 4 is that it's a game with rather limited mechanics where you never feel like you're repeating yourself across its 12-hour runtime. It accomplished this with fantastic enemy variety, but also variety in its set pieces. RE4 may just be a game of moving and shooting, but the game is constantly redefining how you move and shoot on a room-to-room basis. The added mechanical complexity of the remake, while largely well considered, is a step away from the purity and idiosyncrasies of the original and a step towards homogeneity. More homogeneity with modern third-person shooters, and more homogeneity across its own campaign. Because while the vast majority of RE4's most iconic set pieces have been preserved and expanded faithfully, many have been excised entirely or condensed in a way that allows the developers to get the most out of areas and assets. The level design is a bit more circular than it used to be. For instance, the cabin where the fight with Luis takes place is now in an area you run past very early on in the game, rather than its own distinct location. Other areas like the lake and the freezer have been widened to encourage greater backtracking across the same space, as opposed to the mostly linear progression of the original. While the reuse of areas is certainly more economical from a development standpoint, just a teensy bit of the original's magic, where nearly every room felt like some wild one-off idea, is lost. Nowhere is this more true than with the brand new side quests. To the game's credit, side quests are one of the clearest avenues for expansion. It's always felt strange to me that the original has exactly one side quest and it's at the very beginning. But now that the game is just chock full of blue medallions, I think it's easy to see why the original didn't think it was an idea worth repeating. Blue medallions make sense as a way to help new players practice aiming and cement the game's focus on spatial awareness, but it's ultimately a shallow concept. It's hard to say that repeating it so many times adds anything meaningful to the experience. It's just another thing to add to a checklist. The same goes for the new rat-killing side quests, which are just about the last thing I want to be doing in a Resident Evil game. It's not all negative though. The quests involving enemies that aren't found anywhere else in the campaign are really cool, and it's great that you can complete quests without having to read about them first. On my first playthrough, I completed the Lunkerbass side quest without even knowing it was a quest at all. Still, it all feels like adding more stuff for the sake of adding more stuff. The same is true of the expanded shooting gallery. The figurines you get for playing actually affect the main gameplay now, which on some level is commendable, but the effects are mostly inane and doled out through a literal gacha game. The rat quests are one thing, but spending tokens for a random chance at an item which gives me a plus 30% crafting bonus is the actual last thing I want to be doing in a Resident Evil game. It's optional and largely unintrusive, but that's the most I can say for it. Speaking of random bullshit though, it's hard not to feel like the increased randomness in enemy hit reactions is a huge step backwards. On hardcore and professional, it tends to take anywhere from 1 to 5 headshots to trigger a melee prompt. This is in contrast to the original where one headshot was all you needed, simple as that. This new adjustment doesn't just feel worse on a visceral game feel level, the inconsistency of it undermines your ability to form meaningful strategies in the heat of battle. It hurts offensive play since crowd control opportunities like the roundhouse kick are now somewhat RNG dependent, but it also muddies your defensive options since headshots are no longer guaranteed to interrupt an enemy's attack animation. In a sense, that's good because it means the player will rely on the parry more and degrade the knife faster, but that's not worth the trade-off of dragging down the combat design with all this guesswork. There are ways to increase your likelihood of staggering enemies. On my professional mode playthrough, I was able to get extremely consistent 2 headshot staggers throughout the castle section. But the mechanics of it are so obtuse, I honestly couldn't tell you why this was happening. I thought it was because I was using a maxed out Punisher with the laser sight, but a friend tried the same setup and they were still getting 4 headshot staggers. I'm sure there's a logic behind it, but it's a far cry from the immediately intuitive and consistent reactions of the original game. This is a problem compounded by the aiming reticle which carries over from the Resident Evil 2 remake. Handguns and machine guns have wide reticles that focus in if you're standing still and increase the likelihood of causing staggers. At first this seemed like a clever way of replicating the stiff pacing of the original game, rewarding players for taking a huge risk by standing still in the middle of an enemy swarm, but the execution of this is botched pretty hard. Unless you're using the Red 9 or TMP with their stock attachments, moving the camera will either freeze the reticle in place or zoom it back out, depending on the gun. What this means is that if you want to use a focus shot, you have to draw your gun and let go of both analog sticks while you wait for the reticle to zoom in. By the time it finishes, your target will almost certainly have moved out of the way, so you then have to aim your gun a second time. Needless to say, the system is far too awkward and slow to be relied on when you actually need it, during large crowd fights. With the inconsistency and inaccuracy of the reticle's random bullet spread, I'm hard-pressed to think of a reason why carrying it over from the previous remakes was necessary, especially when the original's laser sight is in here as an unlockable for the handguns. I'm not sure what the game gains by burdening players with a less precise system. Though I suppose it speaks to broader differences in the remake versus the original. The old game was very much controlled chaos, while the new one is often just chaos. A lot has been said for RE4's tank controls and the inability to move while shooting. It's often pointed out that enemies tend to slow down within a certain distance of Leon, clearly a behavior designed to offset his control limitations, but not enough is said for just how much the controls inform the design of the game. The restrictive movement isn't a quality of life issue, it's the central pillar of the combat system. The reason the game is still the reigning champion in the fields of crowd control and positioning is that Leon is kind of bad at moving. The all-digital control scheme gives you extreme precision, but the lack of a strafe and limited camera system leaves you wide open with huge blind spots. You have to be extremely thoughtful about where, when, and why you're moving Leon if you want to stay on top of things. It's important to remember that restrictions on the player and the ways obstacles exploit them are the source of challenge and dynamics in a game, and Resident Evil 4's specific restrictions may be unconventional, but that's exactly why the game still has such a unique dynamic despite how influential it's been. With enemies being so slow, it's a bit easier to deliberately manipulate and group them together, though tons of their attacks exist to punish those who play that way, standing stock still like it's a House of the Dead cabinet. There's the projectile attacks, of course, but the Plagas enemies are my favorite threats to deal with. Their huge radial sweep feels like such a logical outgrowth of Leon's movement system, demanding the player periodically pack up and find some other safe zone to pop off a few shots from. These attack patterns and behaviors obviously still work with the remake's more modernized control scheme, but are slightly trivialized by Leon's new options, and it's telling that the enemies tend to come in greater numbers, they all became faster and more aggressive, and were given plenty of new attacks as well to compensate for the less restrictive controls. All these changes in the remake, more complex and quicker enemies, the parry system, inconsistent hit reactions, and a less precise reticle, these all seem to prioritize the immediate and unexpected over the methodical precision of the original game, constantly throwing wrenches into your best laid plans at blinding speeds. And when it works, it really works. The fight with the Chainsaw Sisters was never one I thought much of before, but now with its larger horde of enemies and much wider playfield, it's been turned into one of the combat highlights of the entire game for me. There's a lot to love here, but this more chaotic style of combat is often as frustrating as it is exhilarating. Case in point, Ashley. In the original, she's as easy to work with as AI companions come. She stays right behind Leon, and the camera even zooms out so that you don't lose sight of her. One of the hidden benefits of being stuck in place while aiming is that it means Ashley is free to just rotate around you, so you don't have to worry about her accidentally walking into the line of fire. Ashley behaves a bit differently in the remake though, and while these changes don't ruin the game or anything, I end up feeling like I have to consciously work around her quirks much more than I ever did previously. The first problem is that you can no longer freeze her in place, instead you can only change the distance she follows you from, and even when keeping her in the tight formation, she follows you from a greater distance than she used to, and the camera no longer zooms out to help you keep track of her. She still does her damnedest to stay behind Leon's back, but with the less restrictive moving and shooting, I find it significantly easier to get her mixed up in a crowd of enemies this time around. One extremely specific annoyance I encountered stemmed from this game's tighter resource management. There were plenty of areas where I was low on ammo, greatly outnumbered, and pretty much had to run away. This became needlessly frustrating when Ashley got involved, since she can be blinded by flash grenades now. Fleeing is turned into an exercise in teasing out the exact distance that you can stun enemies from without also stunning her, frequently spinning the camera around to make sure she didn't start lagging behind. I'm assuming her less predictable behavior is why they removed her health bar, but what they replaced it with also causes issues. Ashley becomes incapacitated after taking damage and will die on the next hit if you don't pick her up. This is fine in most situations. Hell, I sometimes found it beneficial to leave her on the ground, since at least that meant I wouldn't lose track of her, but it becomes a serious pain in the ass during the catapult sequence at the castle entrance. On Professional at least, you're more or less screwed if Ashley takes damage. Leaving her incapacitated isn't an option since she'll get hit by another cannonball and die, but you also can't help her back up either since the animation is so slow that you'll get hit by a cannonball and die. It feels like a set piece directly carried over from the original without considering how the new mechanics would affect it. Not helping is that the explosive barrels can only be hit from hyper-specific vantage points now for some reason. Unfortunately, this isn't the only set piece which suffers in the remake. A few bosses in particular read as noticeable downgrades to me, mainly Del Lago, who is less annoying overall, but the lack of momentum on the boat makes avoiding debris trivial and the fight feel toothless. I'm not a fan of this new take on Mendez either. The barn you fight him in is significantly less claustrophobic, and the second phase where he sticks to the back of the room sucks out a good deal of tension for me. The hitboxes on El Gigante's attacks are now frustratingly massive to compensate for Leon's more flexible movement, and while the fight with two Gigantes finally delivers on its premise by preventing you from immediately killing one of them, it's become a much more rigid fight in the process, removing your ability to damage the armored one until a specific cutscene plays. The biggest upset for me though was probably the minecart sequence. In the original, it's a really great test of spatial awareness as you're locked into a cramped set of carts with enemies to your front and back, forcing you to stay on the move from one cart to another, all while taking out the ganados above you before they have a chance to jump in. The remake stops enemies from getting in the cart with you, turning this segment into a dollar store rail shooter with maximum spectacle and minimal danger. It's a minecart set piece in a game called Resident Evil 4, but it's not the Resident Evil 4 minecart set piece. The game's take on the island chapters is similarly disappointing. The complete removal of the U3 boss fight makes this final third feel far more monotonous than it already did. The section with Mike during chapter 15 is especially rough. The game throws just about every enemy type it can at you and some extra enemy turrets for good measure. This should be the combat highlight of the entire game, the moment where all the systems come together and really sing. And maybe my opinion will improve as I understand the game more and get better at it, but right now it feels like entirely too much at once, especially on Professional, which removes autosaves and expects you to get through these 3 gigantic fights in a single go. My gut instinct is to just not engage with any of that shit and run for the exit as fast as I can. This is a problem compounded by the ranking system, which rewards speed above all else. The Resident Evil series is no stranger to ranking systems, but the original RE4 didn't have one, and I think for good reason. With such an action-heavy game that places greater emphasis on encounter design than constructing complex player mechanics, I'm not sure there's a way to add a ranking system without funneling the player into extremely specific and rote playstyles. Instead of concretely telling you how well you did, the game just shows you a couple different stats and lets you rank your performance. But now, with speed being canonized as the ultimate goal, you're encouraged to disengage from the game's central hook, its combat system, and sloppily sprint past everything that makes the game interesting for the sake of a slightly better letter grade at the end. There are some worthwhile aspects to playing for rank though. Avoiding combat makes what few mandatory fights there are much harder since you'll be short on cash and ammo. Side quests and treasure hunting become more interesting since you have to plan out which ones are worth the time cost, and finding small route optimizations through clever item usage or knowledge from prior playthroughs is always rewarding. But on the whole, the rank system feels like a thoughtless carryover from the previous games, which actively distracts from what makes the remake truly engaging. All I'm saying is that if the lowest possible grade you're willing to give players is a B, you should probably rethink how the ranking works, or if it's even worth including in the first place. Now, it's easy to sit here and complain about little nitpicks or downplay the remake's accomplishments by saying it's only as good as it is because it's copying RE4's homework. While this is true to an extent, I don't think it's giving this game nearly enough credit, because for every problem here, there's a fresh new idea that either offers outright improvements or at the very least an interesting divergence from the original. The extra ladder during the cabin fight gives you another route to take and the enemies a new way to flank you. Throwing Ashley and the cultists into the hedge maze lends it some solid variety that it was previously lacking. There's even a couple set pieces that are 100% new. The sequence where you have to avoid the regenerator while also protecting Ashley from being kidnapped is particularly inspired. Maybe a little too easy to cheese, but I'm just sincerely impressed that the developers found meaningful ways to expand on a game that already felt like it had fully explored every one of its ideas. The regenerators in general get a lot of love here. The new bit where you have to spot a wrench inside one's belly is really cute, and right afterwards the game spawns enemies carrying explosives into this room where multiple regenerators are sleeping behind very thin sheets of glass. It's an extremely tense moment, completely unique to this remake. And this is the note I want to end on. With a game as beloved as the original Resident Evil 4, any remake is going to come under some seriously intense scrutiny. I honestly had no hope that this project would turn out halfway decent after having some serious problems with Resident Evil 8. And just on a gut level, the very notion of an RE4 remake feels a little bit insulting. It should say a lot then that despite all my complaints, I'm still in love with this game. The execution may not be perfect, but its foundation remains rock solid. Through both its successes and failures, it sheds new light on what made the original such a masterpiece, allowing me to appreciate that game in ways I never have before, but also shows me what potential was laying dormant, ideas that could have been tweaked or expanded, and entire new systems that provide a weird and worthwhile spin on things. I think that makes it a damn good remake.